This summer, I spent a few days at Chautauqua, a tranquil community in upstate New York whose residents gather each summer to hear from speakers, artists, and musicians. This was actually our second visit to Chautauqua. 5 years ago, I served there as a chaplain. I was actually the first Jewish chaplain to serve at Chautauqua, and I offered sermons each morning and then took long walks by the lake every evening. Sometime between my first and second visit, Salman Rushdie was brought up to Chautauqua as an honored guest speaker. Moments after he took the stage, the same stage from which I preached every morning, an assailant lunged at him and stabbed him mercilessly and repeatedly. He suffered, as you probably read, grave injuries. His stomach, his neck, his right eye. It's truly a miracle that he's alive. So this year, in preparation for my return to Chautauqua, I read Rushdie's new book called Knife, about that brutal attack, about how he survived, how love helped him reclaim life, and even how he made art from calamity. This is a stunning and profound book. Rushdie, as many of you know, lived for more than 3 decades under a fatwa calling for his assassination. So listen to his words. "We are engaged in a world war of stories," he writes. "A war between incompatible versions of reality. Above all, we must understand that stories are at the heart of what is happening." I'm certain that Rushdie is right about the centrality of stories in the unfolding of our reality. The stories that we tell about ourselves, our people, our society, and others matter. In fact, I hear in Rushdie's word a hint of what emerges from our High Holy Day Torah readings. On Rosh Hashanah, we read Genesis 21 and 22, 2 stories of family dysfunction that seem strangely ill-fitting for the grand celebration of the birthday of the world. The reading on the first day of the holiday is an us versus them story in which Sarah orders her husband Abraham to banish Hagar and her son Ishmael from their house on account of Sarah's own son Isaac. Abraham here is caught between one wife and son and another, and he's anguished. He yearns to protect Ishmael, who is, after all, also his son. But Sarah insists that Abraham choose. This house is not big enough for both of us. Ultimately, Ishmael and Hagar are sent away, but this story's not over. As we soon learn, literally nobody in this family is left unscathed. In the very next chapter, Abraham's called by God to sacrifice his other child, his beloved Isaac. And while we might have expected Abraham to protest against this terrible order, instead he demonstrates enthusiastic willingness. As we read on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Abraham gets up early in the morning, eager to fulfill God's command. Now, Isaac ultimately survives the ordeal, but Abraham never speaks with him or with Sarah again. The family is completely shattered. I want to ask you this year to consider these 2 incidents, Ishmael's banishment on day 1 and Isaac's near sacrifice on day 2, in light of one another. One could reasonably conclude that the reason that Abraham, a beacon of moral clarity, failed to protect his son Isaac from sacrifice is that the experience of sending away Ishmael against his own better judgment hardened his heart. Something broke inside of Abraham. From the moment Abraham silenced his instinct to love Ishmael, he could no longer fully love Isaac either. His heartlessness toward one child opened the door to his heartlessness toward the other. I read these Abraham narratives now through the lens of our friend Reverend Zachary Hoover, who shared on our reparations panel last year on Rosh Hashanah a similar theory when it comes to race. He argued that violence among white men, even their own white families, is counterintuitively in part caused by racism. This is how it works. Racism trains us not to feel certain human emotions like empathy towards certain people, people whom our society's racial hierarchy deem unworthy. But as human beings, our biology doesn't know race. So once the brain and the heart are trained to block empathy, we become less empathic generally, not only toward the other, but also toward our own. This is striking. We begin every year, these holiest of days, with the reminder of the danger of one particular family story, a scarcity story. Pay attention, the Torah seems to be saying. The toll of this story is real and it is reverberative. Now I want you to consider today's Torah reading. Whereas on Rosh Hashanah, we read about two sons, one banished to the wilderness forever and the other nearly slaughtered. On Yom Kippur, just this morning, we read about two goats, one banished to the wilderness forever and the other slaughtered. The parallels here are absolutely astonishing and no mere coincidence. The scarcity story we see is not just a one-time event. The act of sending away Ishmael and nearly killing Isaac establishes a pattern that can be tracked through the generations of our family. From Isaac and Ishmael to Jacob and Esau to Joseph and his brothers to these poor goats out in the wilderness. We are plagued by a "this house isn't big enough, my heart isn't big enough" mentality. And that mentality always harms not only the one who's sent away, but also the one who gets to stay. So I want to be really clear. This is not a sermon about brothers. And this is not a sermon about goats. It's not even a sermon about the scarcity story that's still being litigated to this day between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac in Israel. That's not the sermon, though it could have been. It's just that I'm assuming you already know where I stand on that, especially after Rosh Hashanah, and after this past year, and after the past 20 years. This is a sermon about stories. I hear our tradition warning us, be careful lest you get trapped in a bad story, one that repeats over generations, establishing an inescapable pattern. Be careful lest a story become a motif, assimilated into your or your people's self-understanding. And this message feels particularly urgent this year as our national story here in the United States hews closely to a dangerous historical pattern, one that threatens grave harm to our community and to our democracy. This story starts with loneliness. As an individual experience, we know that loneliness is a source of great suffering. As a cultural phenomenon, loneliness poses an existential threat. It was Hannah Arendt, the great 20th century political philosopher, who argued that widespread loneliness, what she describes as among the most radical and desperate experiences of man, could not only hurt our hearts, but decimate our democracies. Here's the thinking. A would-be authoritarian can rise to power only in a society of widespread social disconnection. A nation in which people do not know or trust their neighbors is powerless to respond to any grave threat, whether that threat is political, social, environmental, or otherwise. Arendt writes, isolation and impotence have always been characteristic of tyrannies. It was the pervasiveness of these conditions in Germany in the 1930s that left the country so vulnerable to totalitarianism. This is a timeless warning, but it's particularly resonant in our time. As we all know, our society today is suffering from a crisis of loneliness, social alienation, and disconnection so pervasive that the Surgeon General has termed it an epidemic. However prevalent loneliness was in the 1930s, one must imagine that it doesn't even compare to the crisis of isolation that we're experiencing today. Think of the work of Jonathan Haidt. Haidt argues that an addictive, unregulated social media ecosystem is fueling a spirit of fear, sadness, hopelessness, and rage that is isolating us, and even more so our kids, from the communities of care and support that we all so desperately need. We know that the social and emotional lives of an entire generation have been demolished as we have become connected to everyone in the world and disconnected from those most proximate to us. Of course, some people will dismiss any comparison between the rise of Nazism and current political trends, but I am compelled by Timothy Snyder's argument that resistance to such comparisons is actually rooted in a dangerous American exceptionalism, an unearned confidence that we'd never fall prey to those trends, it could never happen here. But never again, he reminds us, is something that you work for, not something that you inherit. And so we have to ask, are we at risk right now of repeating one of the worst stories of modernity in this country in our time? Here, I want to just share with you that in our home, we made a rule a few years ago that the kids could never share at the dinner table something that they saw on TikTok. They could, however, share something that they read in a Princeton peer-reviewed article. The hope was an elevated discourse. The reality was a lot of shared TikTok memes through the guise of peer-reviewed articles. I say this now because whether you read this in a Princeton peer-reviewed article, meaning you saw it on TikTok, or you read Timothy Ryback's book on Hitler's rise to power in 1932, or you read Adam Gopnik's review on Ryback's book in The New Yorker, you are probably familiar with the rising chorus of concern today about the parallels between then and now. The confounding ascendancy of a person, quote, whom the entire political class regarded as a chaotic clown, a lazy buffoon with a violent following, someone immune to the normal human impediments to absolute power, most notably shame. The big lie told by the would-be tyrant, and all of the accompanying smaller lies, so patently absurd that the people become trained to distrust the reality of their own experience, even when it's eminently clear that they are being lied to. And the fact that this story really takes flight in a political culture of fear and hatred, distrust and division, fertile ground for a very old and irresistible story, one that the West just can't seem to quit. The story of a Jewish world conspiracy, what Arendt called the most efficient fiction of Nazi propaganda. This strikingly emerges at the confluence of interests of right-wing nationalists and left-wing socialists who, despite their vastly different worldviews, share a common enemy: the Jews. All of that was written about a time gone by. Meanwhile, Arendt warns that an atomized society leads to the proliferation of conspiracy theories, of binary us versus them thinking, and of an overwhelming feeling of powerlessness, trends that we see playing out in real time as we speak. Only a few weeks ago, the former president, who recently brought the deranged lie that Haitian immigrants eat their pets to the national debate stage, claimed that if he were to lose the upcoming election, Jewish people would have a lot to do with that loss. Just this week, we heard reiterated the libelous charge that Jews control the weather by a sitting U.S. representative in the midst of a catastrophic hurricane. And if you think that's just insane, and everybody who hears it knows that it's insane, you have to know that days later, posts on X garnering more than 17 million views attacked Jewish public officials at FEMA, at DHS, and elsewhere for their plot to, quote, slowly and methodically take over local, state, and ultimately federal government. Jewish officials in these posts were identified by name and photo with the caption, "No wonder FEMA is so slow to help rural white Americans." Meanwhile, up in San Francisco, our friend Manny's Cafe, a hub for civic engagement and progressive activism, was badly vandalized on Sunday because he, the owner, is a Jew. And even on their way into Rosh Hashanah services last week, members of our community told me that they were met right outside these gates with shouts of "Free Palestine." And I had to explain, as I have too many times this year, that saying "Free Palestine" is not anti-Semitic, but shouting it at a group of Jews walking into High Holy Day services is anti-Semitic. Consider for a moment our university campuses and the political square over the past decade, increasingly aggressive, absolutist discourse exacerbated by a conflict-craving algorithm that was literally built to amplify the most outrageous and pernicious voices. And think about the growing feeling of impotence and exasperation in our time, a rampant cynicism around our political processes, and an overwhelming distrust in government. Almost half of Gen X says that even though they are eligible to vote, they will not vote in the upcoming election. There is a dangerous story unfolding in America as we speak. The story of a lonely, bitter, atomized population seeking meaning and belonging through attachment to ever more extreme political movements, figures, and ideologies. And this story doesn't just rhyme with the past around the edges. This is a pattern, a playbook. It's an old story recast in our time. Precise circumstances never repeat, Gopnik writes, yet shapes and patterns often recur. I fear that this story is hurtling us toward a very dark reality, one that threatens not only the Jewish people, but all Americans and democracy itself. But before we pull out our passports, folks, I want to return us to Salman Rushdie. Understanding our core stories and recognizing patterns is the beginning. It's not, of course, the end. For Rushdie, each of us is called into the sacred work of rewriting. We must overcome the false narratives of tyrants, populists, and fools, he writes, by telling better stories than they do, stories within which people want to live. I hear in his words hints of Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli historian, philosopher, and public intellectual, who said in an interview a few months ago that the major conflicts and injustices in the world are all ultimately about the stories that we believe. We, he said, are a storytelling animal. Some people think that humans fight over territory, over food, but this is rarely the case. Think, he said, about the terrible conflict in my region of the world between Israelis and Palestinians. There is enough land to build enough houses and hospitals and schools for everyone. There's enough food to feed everyone. People fight over the imaginary stories in their mind. Who's God's favorite? Who did God give these holy stones to? That is what most conflicts in the world are about. Now, for Harari, that's actually the good news, because he argued that if conflicts are about objective things, then the only way to end them is through violence. But if conflicts are about the stories that we believe, there is a chance, at least in some cases, there is perhaps a chance to write a better story. Of course, this brings to mind the words of Brian Stevenson, a prophet in our time, who explains the impetus behind building the Legacy Museum and Memorial in Montgomery in storytelling terms as well. Remember, he says, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. And as long as the narrative of white supremacy reigns in this country, the quest for justice will never be won. We must tell a different story for America. It's so clear that when a broken old story pervades a culture, it is incumbent upon us, those who dream of a better future, to write something better. And is this not, after all, the work of Yom Kippur? The stories we tell, the patterns that they form, help us make sense of our lives and make sense of the world. Those stories can liberate and inspire us, or they can compromise and flatten and even endanger us. And every single one of us has stories that we tell about our own lives, about the way that we love or can't love, about the risks that we take or don't take, about the relationships that we honor and those we undermine, about whether or not we are worthy of love and respect. Many of us feel stuck in our story. Maybe our story's rooted in multi-generational patterns that we feel compelled to replay time and again, even when we know the story is no longer serving us, even when we know that it is self-defeating. Maybe our story's rooted in trauma, and we desperately want to escape it, but we fear that we can't, we don't know how. We feel that we're trapped in these limiting stories, as if we're witnesses to the unfolding of our lives and not agents. We have to remember that our stories may be firm, but they are not fixed. And that is a truth that I have witnessed in this community over and over again. The one who so deeply feared being alone that she nearly drowned in an endless run of harmful relationships and is now thriving, living alone, surrounded by good friends and a true sense of purpose. The one who, after 2 decades of swearing that he'd only be as happy as his least happy child, somehow found a way to embrace joy, even still. The one who knew that he would never love again and now finds himself in the grips of those blessed early days of love. The one who swore that she would never forgive, but eventually realized that she no longer wanted to carry around the burden of resentment, and now feels like a dark chapter in her life is finally closed. We can and we must change the stories of our lives. This is the very essence of tshuva, the promise that change is possible, that we can break patterns before they doom us and future generations to live by their limitations. I'm going to quote here Esther Perel. Dr. Esther Perel says that we are not in control of how life unfolds, but we do have agency over how we structure and interpret it, and those new interpretations can help us get unstuck. She says that new stories can liberate us from defeating narratives, predetermined thinking, and foregone conclusions. It's not about letting go of what's led us to this moment. It's about writing new and different chapters. These new chapters create hope and the possibility of change. Abraham, our ancestor, wrote a scarcity story, but that does not condemn us to that same narrative for the rest of time. We need not remain imprisoned to the stories of the past. As Esther says, the goal is to transform from stasis to movement, from repetition to possibility, from constriction to openness. With that in mind, I invite you again to the dominant story unfolding in America today, a story of isolation, alienation, and narrow-minded extremism, fueled by a deeply unsettling convergence of right and left-wing antisemitism and a would-be authoritarian telling alluring lies while threatening harsh political retribution to his enemies. This story plays on all of our worst instincts, the smallness, the fear, the ever-present sense of scarcity in our hearts, and it threatens to do untold damage to all of us. And unfortunately, this story is exacerbated by a deeply alienating political culture that has led many in our Jewish community to feel deflated and unmoored. Many, even in this room, admit that we feel after this past year a little bit politically homeless, unseen, betrayed, or just confused. I've heard this sentiment from both the right and the left flanks of our community, and I've struggled with some of those feelings myself this year. There will have to be a major healing in the days ahead, a reconciliation in our movements and our coalitions, a rearticulation of precisely who we are and what we stand for. But right now, we have to be very clear. Our most urgent work today is to protect this country from the threat of authoritarianism. Now, when the story of our time conspires to leave us feeling powerless, we must remember that we are not powerless. Every one of us must do everything we can, not only to vote, but to knock on doors, to monitor polls, especially in the face this year of an unprecedented threat against our poll workers, to contribute what we can in the fight for our democracy, to talk to anyone and everyone who will listen about how much this matters, how much is actually on the line. Poised as we are before the unfolding of history, we have a very limited window to defy this story and break this pattern. This is our holiest and most urgent work. We have to fight to reshape our political culture, countering the norm with a better story. Telling a new story will not magically transform our reality, but our reality will never be transformed until we do tell a new story about what's possible, and then begin to bridge the gap between that story and our lives. So in that spirit, there's a story that I want to start to tell for our country and for our time. This is what Arlie Russell Hochschild calls a deep story, a feels as if story. A story that helps us know that we're not alone, that something different is possible. A story that breaks through our cynicism and fatalism and our hard-heartedness. Here's my first draft. I hope you'll all lend your edits. Abraham's house was not big enough for both of his sons. We live in a house that is big enough for all of us. This house was built on dreams. People came from all over the world to take refuge here, to envision something better for themselves and their descendants. Many were able to tap into that promise, the promise of this place. But from the start, it carried a dark truth. It was built on a stolen beam at the expense of indigenous people and by the hands of enslaved people. And it has been burdened by a history of inequality and injustice, brokenness ever since. In its early years, the masters of the house were people who worshiped power and profit and called that God. But it wasn't God. Great suffering permeated every corner of this house beneath that hypocrisy. Fissures and fractures from that time long outlived those early inhabitants, casting a terrible pall for centuries over all who called this place their home. Time and again, the whole house threatened to crumble beneath the weight of callousness and cruelty, degradation and dehumanization. But then emerged a generation, perhaps it will be our generation, that chose to imagine a different kind of future. The people determined that they could not erase the pain of the past, but neither were they willing to ignore it any longer. Maybe they could collectively transform this very house into a place of healing, a counter-testimony to what it had once been. Those days, awesome and terrifying, came to be known as the days of reckoning and redemption. The people sat down together and they opened their hearts. They looked into each other's eyes. They told and they heard stories of suffering and sorrow, of being left behind and being afraid of being left behind. They spoke about their fear for their safety, for their children's future. They even admitted their regret that they had for so long failed to see one another's struggles. They listened deeply and compassionately, and they wept quietly, and some not so quietly. Everyone had a chance to speak. No one was silent. And together, they decided that for all the pain that this house had wrought, they would together build something new, something beautiful, and they got to work. The new house would be ever expansive. It would be known around the world for its embrace of the vulnerable, the tired, and the poor, the huddled masses. No one would be banished or cast aside or sent away from this place. They would welcome everyone because they would remember that they were once strangers too. A spirit of hope and joy and possibility would reverberate through this house. In this house, they would sing together like one of those pop-up gatherings of strangers singing Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah in some warehouse in Brooklyn in perfect harmony, but they would do it every single week, and they would have dance parties every Thursday night, and they would cook together, and they would share family recipes, and they would learn from one another's diverse traditions. Now, since that time, many years have passed. This house is still imperfect, but its people remain committed to realizing an ethic of justice, equity, equality, and love, and to sharing their bounty. A few times it's happened that some squirrely con man comes by the house and tries to corral the people to a different way. He promises them all kinds of riches and privileges them over the other residents. He promises to give them the better room, the one on the second floor with the ocean view. He tries to scare them and turn them against each other, but it doesn't work. Because by now, these people love their neighbors. They don't want to see them hurt. so these scoundrels don't get much traction in this place at all. Sometimes the children in this house still hurt one another. Most of the time they work through their fights on their own. They all remember stories from their grandparents about the days of reckoning and redemption and how much it means to someone who's been hurt to simply be heard. And when conflicts emerge between two children that cannot be solved on their own, maybe like the dispute between Ishmael and Isaac, they go to the grown-up. And even when one child has hurt the other badly, the grown-up, unlike Abraham before her, gazes at both of them with loving eyes and says, you are an image of God. I know that you can do better. And when they hear that, they believe her. And the two take each other's hands and they walk back outside to play. And it's true that one of them gives the other just a little pinch right outside the door. But that's okay, because that's what children do. They know that there's room for both of them to stay and grow and work things out in this home. This home that we all live in is flawed and striving and very much worth fighting for. Every writer knows that confronting the blank page can be utterly terrifying. But the thing is, none of us has to do this work alone. In a crisis that's fueled by loneliness and isolation, we are one another's greatest strength. Remember, we built this very community because we desperately and improbably yearned to tell a new story. We can do this. Together, we can write a better story, and we must. Gamar Chatima Tova, Shana Tova.